Something important happened this week, and it didn't land the way it should have. Mark Carney stood in front of the press and almost in passing reframed Canada's relationship with the United States. Not as strained, not as under pressure, but as something that is fundamentally changed. And the room didn't follow him there. The questions stayed small, the answers kept pulling upward. And what you were left with was a moment where the headline didn't match the reality underneath it. Because if he's right, then we're not dealing with a rough patch. We're dealing with a shift.
From the headlines to what's really going on underneath. This is The Canadianist. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Here's Chris.
Hello, friends, fellow Canadians. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. Welcome to the podcast. This is The Canadianist. Okay, so the press conference in question, the exchange itself was fairly typical on the surface. A question about Ontario's alcohol distribution system, specifically the LCBO, and whether moves there could aggravate tensions with the United States. It's the kind of issue that normally spirals into a broader conversation about retaliation and escalation, especially in a moment like this. But Carney doesn't go there. He acknowledges it, but he doesn't stay with it. Instead, he redirects the conversation towards tariffs, aluminum, autos, forest products, and he frames those as the real issue. Not just politically, but legally. He's pointing to violations of existing agreements, which is a very different place to stand other than reacting to a provincial policy decision. And that move tells you something about how the federal government is trying to hold the line right now. There's a conscious effort to avoid getting dragged into a reactive loop where every move gets answered with another move. Instead, the focus is being kept on areas where Canada can argue from a position of structure and legitimacy, not just response. And up to that point, it's disciplined, it's controlled. It's the kind of positioning you would expect in a tense trade environment. But then he goes further, and he starts talking about the relationship itself, and that is where the tone shifts. Not dramatically, and not with a big rhetorical flourish, but in a way that changes the meaning of everything around it. He describes the current moment as a rupture, not a disagreement, not a phase, a rupture. And once that word is out there, everything else has to be understood differently. There's no real suggestion that the goal is to return to the previous level of integration or to rebuild what was there in the same form. Instead, the language shifts towards adaptation, towards new conditions, towards agreements that reflects a different reality, not a restored one. And that's a significant departure from how Canada has approached this relationship for decades. The working assumption has always been that despite periodic tensions, the path forward was deeper integration, that you could absorb the shocks because the underlying structure remained intact. But what Carney is signaling, without fully unpacking it, is that the structure itself may have changed. You can see the tension when that happens. The questions don't really adjust. They stay grounded in the immediate, in the tactical, in the kinds of issues that typically define these exchanges. And he keeps pulling the conversation up to a higher level, trying to reframe what's being discussed. And that mismatch is very noticeable. It's not dramatic, but it's there. There's also a moment that gives you a glimpse into how he approaches these things. At one point, he refers to the provincial actors as clients and then corrects himself. It's a small slip, but it's very revealing. It suggests a mindset that's more rooted in systems and institutional relationships than the language of politics. He's thinking in terms of structures, roles, functions, not necessarily in terms of how those ideas land in a political moment. And that comes through in the way he communicates. He's measured, deliberate, precise, but he's not always immediate. He doesn't simplify the message to match the pace of the exchange. That can read as hesitation even when it isn't. So what you end up watching is a conversation happening on two different levels at the same time. The surface level, which is where the questions are, and the structural level, which is where he's trying to take it, and they don't quite meet. But if you follow what he's actually saying, and you strip away the framing of the questions, the message is fairly clear. Canada is not positioning itself for a return to the old economic relationship with the United States. It's positioning itself for something else. And that is the part that didn't fully land. Hello, friends, fellow Canadians. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. This is The Canadianist. Welcome back. This is the second half of the podcast. The first half, we were setting up talking about Mark Carney's press conference this week, where he was specifically addressing, where he was asked about the LCBO in particular, but also broadly all of the liquor commissions across the country and their decisions not to carry American alcohol on the shelves. And then we started talking about the state of the relationship with the United States right now. So that was the first half of the show. We walked through what was happening in that exchange and how it unfolded. But the more important piece is what sits underneath it, because that's where the implications start to widen. If the relationship with the United States is entering a different phase, then this isn't something that you negotiate your way out of in the usual sense. It becomes something you have to manage over time, and that's a very different kind of challenge. Most of the public conversation isn't there yet. It's still anchored in the idea that this is a dispute that will eventually settle, that there'll be a path back to something familiar even if it takes time. That assumption is doing a lot of work in how people interpret what's happening. But if that assumption no longer holds, then the way we're framing these developments start to fall short. Because the individual flashpoints, the tariffs, the policies, the provincial decisions, they begin to look less like isolated issues and more like symptoms of a broader shift. And if you stay focused only on the symptoms, you never really address the underlying change. And that's where the risk starts to build. A transition like this doesn't just affect trade policy. It affects how businesses plan, how governments prioritize, and how people think about stability. The Canada-US relationship has been kind of a constant in the background of all of that. Not without tension, but predictable enough to anchor decisions. If that predictability starts to erode, even gradually, the adjustment isn't just economic. It becomes psychological. It changes expectations. And those expectations matter because they shape how people respond when things start to move. And what's challenging here is that the communication hasn't fully caught up to the scale of the shift being described. Carney is speaking in structural terms, but the translation into everyday understanding isn't complete. The connection between what he's saying and what people are experiencing isn't always made explicit. So the conversation drifts. It gets pulled back towards personalities, towards short-term reactions and familiar political lines. That's understandable because those are easier to grasp. They give people something concrete to hold on to. But they also don't explain what's changing. There's a practical side to all of this, too. If Canada is moving into a period where the relationship with its largest trading partner is less stable or less integrated, then diversification stops becoming a talking point and becomes a necessity. Not in theory, but in execution. That takes time, and it takes coordination, and it often unfolds unevenly. At the same time, there's a need to maintain stability internally while that adjustment happens. That's a difficult balance to strike because the more you acknowledge change, the more you risk unsettling expectations. But the less you explain it, the more confusion you create when the effects start to show up. And that tension is already visible. This is where I think some of the pushback is fair. Operating at a structural level is important. Seeing the bigger picture is also important. But it's not enough on its own. If the public conversation is happening somewhere else, then there's a responsibility to bridge that gap, to make the implications clear, to connect the dots in a way that people can follow without having to reinterpret everything themselves. Otherwise, the risk isn't just misunderstanding, it's misalignment. You end up with a government preparing for one kind of reality and a public reacting to another. That's when trust starts to erode, not necessarily because the decisions are wrong, but because the context isn't shared. So the moment we're in right now sits somewhere between those two things. On one hand, a recognition at the top that something fundamental may be shifting in Canada's economic relationship with the United States. On the other hand, a public conversation that hasn't fully caught up to that idea. And bringing those two into alignment is the real task. Because if that doesn't happen, we're going to keep circling around individual issues, debating them as if they exist in isolation while the structure around them continues to change. And by the time that change becomes obvious to everyone, the conversation will already be behind it. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As we move forward, we're going to start expanding the show, more topics, more depth, and more engagement. And once the studio is ready, we'll be moving into a new space and bringing video into the mix as well. There's a lot coming, and I'm looking forward to building this out with you. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss the next episode. I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and I'm a Canadianist. And if this resonates with you, I invite you to continue the conversation at thecanadianist.news. And to find out more about the United Canadian Centrists and our vision for Canada's future, visit uccparty.ca. See you next time.
You've been listening to The Canadianist. New episodes daily. Real conversations about Canada. What's happening, why it matters, and where it's all heading. Subscribe and stay connected. The Canadianist.